Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Financial Services Observatory webinar series. I'm Michael Wexler, your host, and today's webinar is on cybersecurity and gender, being presented by the DFS Observatory's Samikshya Siwakoti. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. Please make sure that your microphones are switched off and stay in the mute position. Please do not use video. And if you wish to ask questions, please do not ask them via audio at any time. You can use the chat box and send your question to the moderator or the host. We will take questions, time permitting, at the end of the presentation. This is the DFS Observatory website. It is located at dfsobservatory.com. On our website, you can find a host of information related to digital financial services. We have our curated library of DFS-related laws, regulations, and policies. It's a fully searchable database. You can also find archived webinars and quizzes on DFS-related topics. You can test your knowledge. We also have comments and policy documents on DFS regulation and publications on a range of DFS-related topics, including blockchain and regulatory sandboxes. They are published by the DFS Observatory, as well as from other resources such as the ITU DFS Focus Group. On our website, you can also see our current list of upcoming events, as well as an archive of our previous events in a video archive. Our events include an annual summit, such as the one on digital finance that just took place on February 7th. We also produce roundtables, conferences, webinars such as this. I will briefly mention that our next scheduled event is a webinar to take place on March 10th at 10 a.m. New York City time, being given by Ivo Jenik of CGAP on fintech sandboxes, also known as regulatory sandboxes. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our DFSO team at Columbia Business School. Columbia Business School is located in Uris Hall on the Columbia University campus, which is that white building right at the bottom of that beautiful photo of New York City, just below the building with the round dome. The Digital Financial Services Observatory is a project of the Columbia Institute of Teleinformation, also known as CITI, at Columbia Business School. At the top is Professor Eli Noam, who is the director of CITI, Dr. Leon Perlman, who is the head of the DFSO and the usual host of this program. I am Michael Wexler. Jason Buckwitz is the executive director of CITI. Keith Bowie is my colleague, research scholar at the DFSO, and Samikshya Siwakoti, research staff at the DFSO, who is today's presenter on cybersecurity and gender. I'd like to take another brief moment just to let you know about our next physical event taking place on Columbia University campus. It's a roundtable event on trends in anti-money laundering and fraud, taking place on Tuesday, March 17th at Warren Hall on the Columbia University campus in New York City. Please make sure to register for this event as we have limited capacity. You can register for the event on our website, dfsobservatory.com. You can see our latest agenda on the DFS Observatory website on the event page. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's webinar presenter, Samikshya Siwakoti, presenting on cybersecurity and gender.
Thank you for the introduction, Mike. I will start with the agenda for today's presentation. We will start off with terminology. The presentation is divided into two parts. The first part, we want to cover cybersecurity, risk, and fraud in developing countries. We will discuss the background of the problem, the challenges, the various types of cyber threat, risk, and fraud, as well as factors affecting them. The second part will cover gender representation in cybersecurity with a global focus. We will discuss about the background of the problem, various efforts and initiatives that have been taken to address this issue, as well as the factors and challenges concerning it. Let's start off with the terminology. Cybersecurity is the state of being protected against the criminal or unauthorized use of electronic data or the measures taken to achieve this. We are limiting our scope to the digital financial services sector. Risk is the exposure to harm or loss resulting from breaches of or attacks on information systems within DFS. Fraud is the deliberate deception for unfair or unlawful gain that occurs online or within various other forms of digital financial services. So essentially, we want to emphasize on the DFS sector. For our first part, our research question is that in a developing low to middle income country context, are there challenges that women face that make them vulnerable to cyber threat, risk, and fraud? Cyber attacks that threaten financial inclusion can be broadly classified into four major types. Social engineering is deception or psychological manipulation of people into performing actions or divulging confidential information. The frequent victims of social engineering are those who are new to DFS, who lack or have limited familiarity with digital fraud or various types of frauds as such. Data breaches is the release of private confidential information without proper adequate authorization. It can occur through social engineering, phishing, and malware. External attackers repetitively they attempt to access, disclose, or use critical information that can be readily monetized. System outages are another kind of cyber attack that can threaten financial inclusion. For example, distributed denial of service, DDoS. Here I would like to bring into light an example from Kenya. So in 2017, in Kenya, a system outage left customers without access to their savings and loan products for 5 days. So in this instance, once the system outage was resolved, there were reports of inconsistencies in customer account balances. In fact, system outages have at times acted as a cover-up for fraudulent activities during the outage. Denial of service attacks brought about by external threat sources are another leading cause of such outages. Third-party threats can include third-party provision of services, mobile network, information technology, and data storage solutions. And attackers may be bad actors employed by service providers or other bad actors exploiting weak practices at service providers. The risk factors in digital financial services may come from various means. They can broadly be discussed as product risk, channel risk, agent, customer, compliance, system and delivery associated risk, as well as regulatory supervision and enforcement. Product comes from this fact that there is the emergence of new mobile financial services, various types of digital services and wallets, including bulk payments, mobile credit, savings. Channel arises from the widespread use of mobile phones, which includes many new customers or very less experienced customers that use this channel. Agent associated risk arises from the fact that there are so many different types of agent networks and there is lack of effective monitoring mechanisms in how these agents operate. Customer and compliance challenges are faced by financial institutions to ensure KYC, which is the Know Your Customer due diligence, and how to track criminal activities like money laundering. So these kind of challenges faced by financial institutions are also risk factors in digital financial services. Regulatory supervision and enforcement comes from this fact that there is lack of strong, effective regulations, lots of unlicensed agents and money transfer agencies operating in various parts of the developing world. And the challenges is that bringing all of these institutions and different third parties and various kinds of agent networks into the regulatory supervision and enforcement framework poses a massive challenge across the developing world in particular. Fraud in digital financial services can also arise from different sources and can be broadly discussed in the terms of like consumer related fraud, network downtime fraud, agent fraud, mobile service provider, business partner, or system related fraud. Consumers often, a big challenge that comes when we talk about consumers is that the issue of identity theft is very big. SIM swap is when a subscriber's mobile station international subscriber directory number, NSISDN, is transferred from its current SIM card to a different SIM card without the subscriber's knowledge or consent. Phishing and social engineering scams, false promotions, provider impersonation by bad actors are all associated with identity theft. Network downtime frauds may be one example can be no real-time verification where there's challenges with SIM swaps, over-the-counter transactions. All of these can come under network downtime frauds. Agent fraud, an example of this type of fraud is when there is misuse of PIN numbers, or over-the-counter transaction fraud happens when overcharging of services happens by agent to a consumer who is not very comfortable or not very familiar with the type of product or services they're using, or they may just get charged for services that are typically free. Mobile service provider, business partner, and system related fraud are various other kinds of fraud which also come under different types of fraud that can happen in the digital financial services sector. In terms of gender differences relating to cybersecurity, are there any differences? Are there studies that point this out? We faced a lot of challenges finding solid research on this topic. There is scant data on gender-specific cybersecurity behavior in developing countries. Studies have suggested some gender differences in dealing with cybersecurity issues, but most of them have concerned developed countries. And the challenge here with the developed versus developing country situation is in the developed countries, there is higher sophistication of digital technology usage. The professional environment is different. The user is also a bit more familiar with digital financial services and different kinds of services as opposed to the types of consumers there are in many parts of the developing world. We did find one study focusing on India, so that will be discussed in the next slide, which suggested some gender differences relating to cybersecurity. In developing countries, social and legal issues may also impact cybersecurity, and the reduction of digital and gender divide, which is very important for many reasons, also creates this dilemma because it may translate into greater initial cybersecurity and cyber risk based upon traditional fraud victims being new or just having limited experience with digital financial services. So essentially, the point we're trying to highlight here is as you try to reduce the digital and gender divide regarding digital financial services and financial inclusion, the challenge is also that this will bring in more inexperienced users into this ecosystem, and they will be at a higher risk due to the fact that they have had limited experience with DFS. The India study that I wanted to talk about is a research that has been focusing on smartphone users in India. Research that is specific to gender differences in cybersecurity is extremely limited when it comes to lower income developing countries, and few studies exist but are limited to small sample sizes. So we found this challenge even in the context of this India study. Nonetheless, researchers found that male respondents were better than female respondents regarding the awareness and adoption of security controls. And this stems from the fact that in many of these societies, men have had more exposure and familiarity with digital financial services as opposed to the women of the household. Male respondents also exhibited riskier behavior for downloading apps from an untrusted third party repository, connecting to unsecured Wi Fi networks, updating of apps, and routing or jailbreaking. So, this is kind of hinting us towards a more riskier behavior undertaking by male respondents. Routing here is the term used to describe the process of gaining root access or privileged control over devices, most commonly Android smartphones and tablets. Jailbreaking is another term that I've used here and wanted to highlight that it's in a mobile device context, it's the use of an exploit to remove manufacturer or carrier restrictions from a device. The exploit usually involves running a privilege escalation attack on a user's device to replace the manufacturer's factory installed operating system with a custom kernel. Male respondents in this study also performed better when it comes to regarding reading the user agreement and checking for app permissions. Moving further, let's discuss on the digital and gender divide. In developing countries, the digital and gender divide can be substantial. Overall, there's low literacy and numeracy levels, lack of affordability. The gender divide and digital access and experience with an information and communication technology is substantial. While the digital divide may be closing overall, it is widening for women. Social and legal factors exist which are barriers to access and use of such services. There's limited access, which means that limited skills and familiarity with digital technologies, making them more vulnerable to cyber attacks, risk, and fraud. And closing this gender gap, as we discussed earlier, does introduce a lot of new and inexperienced ICT and DFS users. While digital transfers empower women within their households, they are underrepresented in relation to cyber and ICT inclusion and initiatives, which is a major challenge in this area. Let's look at women's access to cyber internet. As we can see, this chart shows us the digital gender gap is growing fast in developing countries. In context of internet penetration rate for men and women in 2019, we can see how there are much more bigger gender gaps in countries, primarily in parts of the world with developing world, Africa, and Arab states. We can also see this in Asia and Pacific. So this, when it is broken down to developed country context, then the digital gender gap is very, very low. As you can see, it's between 86% for female and 87% for male. So it's quite not as much of a stark difference when we have to talk about in the context of continents like Africa, where it is 33% for male versus 22% for females. The internet user gender gap is widening significantly in developing and least developed countries. We can see substantial gaps from this figure in Africa, in the MENA region, the Southeast Asia. The developed country context is again much better, although we can still see the gender gap exists, and we can see this in comparison to 2013 versus 2019 for various parts of the world. So we can see how there is an interesting pattern in the developed world where it's actually reduced compared to 2013. But if we look at Africa, if we look at Asia and Pacific, if we look at LDCs, Arab states, we can see how compared to 2013, the internet user gender gap has actually increased in 2019. Let's now move on to factors that affect or create this limitation in access to the internet and digital financial services. Limited mobile ownership and internet usage is a major factor. Affordability, low literacy and numeracy, limited relevance for women, male member of family will have and control internet DFS-based access, such as mobile phone ownership. So these all can be broadly put under limited mobile ownership and internet usage. Another important thing that many women have responded as saying as a reason for not having a financial account was that the primary reason for both gender was lack of sufficient funds. But when it came down to gender, then we saw that the women partners depend more on their male partners' access to bank account and DFS services. Women are far more likely to report distance as a barrier. Women also are more likely to report a lack of trust. So we wanted to highlight how men and women may play different roles in the family, which has an impact on digital financial services and their usage. It helps us to understand the dynamics of factors in play, which might explain for the gender disparity and technology gap which exists. Mobile phone and internet gender statistics, we referred to the GSMA study for these uh, statistics. Women in low and middle income countries are 10% less likely than men to own a mobile, which translates into 197 million fewer women than men owning a mobile phone. As mobile subscriber growth slows, the gender gap in mobile ownership is not closing. Across low and middle income countries, 330 million fewer women than men use mobile internet, representing a gender gap of 23%. With the uptake of mobile internet growing quickly, 80% women in low and middle income countries, there is some evidence that this wide gender gap has narrowed. The mobile gender gap varies by region and country, but is widest in South Asia, where women are 28% less likely than men to own a mobile and 58% less likely to use mobile internet. The GSMA estimates that closing this gender gap in mobile internet use across low and middle income countries could add 700 billion in GDP growth, representing an additional 0.7% of GDP growth in these countries over the next 5 years. Women face various types of social, cultural, legal, and systematic barriers to ICT and DFS. As we mentioned before, family, societal, gender roles in Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia are some of the common studies that have come out from various organizations such as the World Bank and CGAP, as well as the GSMA, which are highlighting this fact that women may rely on husbands to hold and manage accounts. 34% of respondents in South Asia have stated they don't have an account because someone in the family has an account. There are cultural norms which also pose significant challenges and barriers to women's access to ICT and DFS. For instance, in Egypt, in some villages, tradition does not allow for women to travel to work, although they may be able to work at home. Hence, they may lack the experience with DFS and online tools in general. There is also this preference for female agents in different parts of the world, specifically in the developing country context. However, there is a dearth of female agents as a DFS is primarily male dominated by male agents. who are not as much of a preference when it comes to women customers. There's also this problem of lack of women in the cybersecurity space to bring diverse gender-specific policy and solutions to address gender-specific issues. Legal barrier also exists. For instance, women more often lack ID documents needed to open formal accounts. An estimated 2 billion people worldwide in 2014 did not have any formal identification document, disproportionately women. Some countries still do not have gender neutral law regarding this issue. Another challenge comes in the form of lack of literacy and numerosity, generally much higher than average level of low literacy and numerosity levels exist in the developing world. Low technical literacy, there are complex products and also linguistic barriers, for example, English graphics and options in MFS, lack of awareness on how to seek help. In terms of phishing and social engineering, there is limited experience and technical knowledge, also limited manpower to address these problems, lack of awareness to take appropriate measure against phishing, victim to fake offers to retrieve personal information is also a challenge that is faced by customers who are not very familiar with DFS. In terms of social and policy challenges, there is we can talk of it in the context of like national policy level where there is not as much of standard level of national policy across the developing world to address gender disparity and gaps. And in some places where there is, the challenge still comes down to the implementation of these policies. Dependency on agents for use of DFS services, example OTC transactions, where social and cultural issues come into play. One example that comes into mind when we talk about the social and cultural context is the example of Jazz Cash in Pakistan, where what happened is women were primarily very much not comfortable with dealing with lots of male agents and the male agent network, which led to lower product update in Pakistan. And Women's World Banking worked with Jazz Cash to partner with Unilever's Women Entrepreneur Training Program. And they leveraged each company's core competencies to increase value for their products and drive financial inclusion for low-income women in Pakistan. The primary focus was to have more women in the agent framework, which really helped update the DFS services. And so this kind of gives us an example of how women-centric solutions are very important when it comes to addressing gender gaps in cybersecurity and gender gaps in just the digital financial divide as well. Agents can exploit women by overcharging fees, misusing of PINs. So misusing PINs is another issue that was highlighted in various case studies in a Bangladesh study, where several stories of women being overcharged or just not being aware that they shouldn't give their PINs to their agents was reported. Women also face safety issues in the context of being higher targets for harassment, because if they share their personal information or their phone numbers, which is very important often in many of the account opening or trying to use DFS or MFS services, having a mobile number, but then sharing that with a male agent can often lead to women being targets of harassment. These issues were also documented in the forms of case studies that were in country-specific studies on this topic. All right, so now let's move on to part two, the gender representation in cybersecurity. We wanted to zoom out from a developing country context to a global focus here, as there is a lot of resources and content regarding this issue on a global level. Globally, what is the gender representation in the cybersecurity workforce, and what are the reasons for any disparity that exists? In general, women comprise of a smaller part of the workforce. In developed countries, gender disparity in the workplace exists and is more pronounced in certain countries and population demographics, such as age. There's definitely an underrepresentation of women in cybersecurity. More so, it is manifested in the lack of diversity in the industry, professionals in the marketplace. And this issue is not limited to developing countries where the barriers are more prominently related to literacy, numeracy, and access to technology. This issue also exists in the developing world where there is not so much of a challenge of access to technology or a more concerning the issue of lack of familiarity with DFS. Studies regarding this topic are very varied and the reporting methodologies are not equivalent. Seminal 2013 Frost and Sullivan study had shown that women comprise of 11% of the global cybersecurity workforce. A collaboration study, now the biennial Global Information Security Workforce Study, done by ISC2, the International Information System Security Certification Consortium, reported 11% in 2017, but 24% in 2019. However, they also mentioned that they used improved and more accurate methodology and that was adjusted to be more inclusive of women with actual cybersecurity responsibilities at least 25% of their work time. So between these two studies, we see an increase in the percentage of women in cybersecurity, but that also exists that challenge that these two studies have used a little bit varied methodology and updated method definitely makes it hard to compare for sure. Women comprise of 19% of cybersecurity specialists. The Global Gender Gap Report of 2020 from the World Economic Forum reported that just in the context of Australia, 30% of AST's Cyber and Information Security Division workforce, which is the largest within ACSC, are women. This chart here shows the gender gap in the workplace. The share of population aged 15 to 64 participating in the labor force by gender. And we can see the gender gap is much high in Mexico, Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia. So that part of the graph shows us a much larger gender gap. And on the other hand, this issue is not as much of a problem in countries like Canada, for instance. The OECD calculations based on national labor force surveys and the China census data is used as a source for this graph. When it comes to the digital gender divide, we also wanted to mention about, in general, what is the gender gap in the labor force and what steps are being taken to address the gender gap in labor force in itself. The G20 declared a gender initiative at Brisbane Summit in 2014, and their target was 25 by 25. Essentially, they committed to reduce the gender gap in labor force by 25% by 2025 as compared to 2012. Key principles to improve quality of women's employment was the main focus, and some selected examples of this initiative include collecting more and accurate gender disaggregated data, set time-bound numerical targets and monitor effectiveness and impact of policies and initiatives, entrepreneurship development for women, target women at different skill levels and economic sectors or in disadvantaged or fragile areas, closing gaps in workforce participation, pay quality full-time work, expanding investments in childcare infrastructures and services, improving workforce conditions for women, and making investments that ensure a greater participation of women in STEM fields. And careers can take the form of internships, career advice, competitive grant programs, awareness programs for women. So these are the different kinds of areas of work that G20 countries have been working towards. What is the comparison of actual versus expected gender gap decline? So this figure is very interesting to take a look at the actual versus expected gender gap decline. We can see this expected decline is much more interesting and different in the context of countries like Japan, where the actual decline is more than the expected decline, including Brazil, Argentina. On the other hand, there are countries like Saudi Arabia where the expected decline is on a much, much lower level versus the actual decline that happened. What are some of the efforts made to not just address the issue of gender gap in the labor market, but also within the cybersecurity industry? There are different organizations and stakeholders working on this issue. One of them is Women in Cybersecurity that does a lot of work with a global focus. There's another program called Empowering Women in Cyber Risk Management by Malaysia Digital Economy Corp, MDEC. There's CTF for Girls in Japan, ISSA, India Women in Cybersecurity, Australian Women in Security Network. So different initiatives, different organizations have come forward to address the issue of cybersecurity gender gap in terms of the labor participation of women as well. And many countries are making policies and taking initiatives to address this issue as well. What about gender-specific cybersecurity studies? The recent India study in 2019 was a very recent one focusing on India. There's also studies which show that women are generally less confident in their skills, they underreport their capabilities, lower cybersecurity engagement, and lower self-efficacy, believes that an individual has about his or her capability of performing a specific set of actions, more careful with managing their data, safety, and security versus men was another conclusion of the India study as well. Gender perceptions can discourage the impact or entry of women in the cybersecurity industry. Perceptions of gender gaps in computer science and cybersecurity industry, for instance, cybersecurity roles are strongly seen as men's job within industry and by many customers and clients. There is perception of lower recruitment levels, lower likelihood of promotion to senior positions. Consistently in several studies, women perceive these to be differences in noticeably greater numbers than men. This was also pointed out by a study of women in cybersecurity by Harvard. Societal discouragement of women exists when it comes to pursuing STEM fields, and not just from a much older age, but from a very, very early age onward itself. There are certain ways that things are imposed in the society or social context that create discouragement for women to pursue STEM. There's also this issue of how women are not fully aware and make certain perceptions of work-life balance and realities in the industry. There's a limited number of role models, corporate leaders, and executives who are female to learn from and just also find mentorship opportunities. Gender bias and discrimination is another disabling factor. Gender harassment is not specific to just cybersecurity, but just a broader general problem in itself. Inequality in recruitment, pay, promotion, and leaderships are all problems which fall under gender bias. Cultural biases of influences and decision makers also exist. There are corporate policies that need to be crafted to address women's unique interests. This figure shows us that 51% of women who were respondents in the ISC2 2017 study experienced discrimination. In terms of forms of discrimination which are faced by women in cybersecurity globally, we can see that 87% reported unconscious discrimination, 53% reported unexplained denial or delay in career advancement, 29% respondents said exaggerated highlighting of their mistakes, errors, or occurrences, 22% reported tokenism, and 19% reported overt discrimination. There's also difference in perception of gender confidence levels. This lack of confidence generally lowers self-assessment and self-efficacy levels. Women are consistently rating themselves lower on tests, including lower perceptions of their skills, and have exhibited less confidence than male counterparts in several studies. Women have less years of actual work experience than male counterparts. However, this is changing over time. Women also have more education background degrees than male counterparts, which is interesting, and women are exhibiting longer tenured positions and gradually becoming higher ranking executives as time moves on. So the takeaway here is that change is occurring, but a full impact or a much greater impact is going to take more time. We can see that overall women have been improving their number of average years in the roles of cybersecurity related, IT related roles, cybersecurity initiatives. Overall, they are still not on par with men in terms of the average number of years in roles, but they are catching up. What's the gender diversity at leading tech companies? Let's take a look. So when compared to 2014 versus 2019, we can see that the gender diversity has improved in all the four major tech companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, as well as Microsoft. So this is definitely a sign of progress and improvement in this sector. But that being said, there is massive gender imbalance, as we can clearly see from this chart. It's still a long way to go for addressing the issue of gender diversity at leading, not just leading tech companies, but also in the whole tech industry. This is the representation of the workforce across disciplines from the Global Gender Gap Report from the World Economic Forum, and it's very recent. It's from 2020. So we can see that the cybersecurity specialist representation here is 19% when it comes to women. The most impact has been seen among young professionals. We can see younger women experiencing less pay inequity when compared across different types of generation. So this figure shows us how much of pay inequity exists, and we can see that millennials face much lesser when it comes to in comparison with Generation X and the baby boomers. So we can see that this is a positive sign of progress in terms of gender disparity in the tech industry. With that, I would like to thank you all for attending our webinar. I hope it was helpful to get a better understanding on the current state of gender issues in developing countries pertaining to digital financial services, the challenges faced, progress made in the cybersecurity and risk space, as well as the discussion on the gender representation in the marketplace, more closely focusing on the global cybersecurity industry. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please reach out to me in my email address provided. You can also visit us at dfsobservatory.com. We will be working on a paper concerning cyber and gender issues in the future and would love to get your feedback for that as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Samikshya, for your comprehensive presentation. Once again, I'd like to take just a moment to remind you of our next upcoming event taking place on the Columbia University campus is a roundtable event on trends in anti-money laundering and fraud taking place on Tuesday, March 17th at Warren Hall in New York City on the Columbia University campus. Again, please make sure that you register at dfsobservatory.com because space is limited. And this takes us to the end of our DFSO webinar on cybersecurity and gender. I'm Michael Wexler in New York City at Columbia Business School, wishing all of you, wherever you are in the world, a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and looking forward to you joining us for our next event.